This is the moment officers arrive at the home of a father in Tallahassee, Florida. A 12-year-old girl is missing. Her name is Lori Paige, and right now, in this moment, nobody knows where she is. That is the only thing anyone is certain of as the first officer steps out of his car and walks toward the front door of that apartment. Everything else, where she went, how she left, who she might be with, is completely unknown. And what looks, in this moment, like a routine missing persons call is about to become something that will consume investigators for the next 2 years of their lives. Because somewhere in this story, buried underneath 2 years of dead ends and false leads and a search that kept circling back to nothing, is a secret. A dark and carefully protected secret that one person has been carrying since the very night Lori disappeared. And by the time investigators finally uncover it, everything they thought they understood about this case will turn out to be completely wrong. It's early June 2023. The mornings in Tallahassee come in slow and humid. Continental Court looks like every other apartment complex in the city. Same rows of parking spaces, same identical doors, same neighbors going about their routines without paying too much attention to what is happening around them. Nothing about this place would make you look twice. Nothing would make you slow down as you drove past, which is exactly why nobody saw anything coming. Lori Paige was 12 years old. She lived in one of those apartments with her father. Her parents were no longer together. Her mother lived separately across town, and Lori moved between both worlds the way a lot of kids in that situation learn to do. Quietly, adaptably, carrying two different versions of normal and figuring out how to make them fit together. On the surface, nothing about her life would raise immediate alarm. But then the call came in. Lori was gone. Officers responded within minutes. They arrived at the apartment, spoke with the adults there, gathered the basic details of the situation, and began working the case the way they always do, starting with what is directly in front of them and expanding outward from there. No assumptions yet, no conclusions, just the process. A neighbor had a security camera positioned with a good angle on the parking lot, and officers asked her to pull the footage covering the full window when Lori would have left. 11 at night, straight through to 10 the following morning, a long stretch of hours to review. But if Lori had walked out of that complex, the camera should have caught something. They sat down and went through every frame. Nothing. No sign of Lori leaving. No unfamiliar cars pulling in or out. No movement in that parking lot that didn't belong there. Just the quiet, unchanging dark of a neighborhood that had absolutely no idea what had already taken place inside one of its units. Officers kept moving, door to door along the complex. Flyer in hand, Lori's face looking back at every person who answered. They watched reactions. They listened carefully to what people said and paid equal attention to what they didn't say. And they asked about sounds in the night, lights they might have noticed, anything out of the ordinary. Nobody had seen her, nobody knew anything. And here is where the investigation made its first critical mistake. Not out of negligence, not out of bad police work, but out of something that felt completely logical given what they knew at the time. Lori had disappeared before, not once, but twice. In one prior incident, she had turned up at an abandoned apartment not far from home. In another, she had been found staying with a family friend. Both times she came back within 24 hours. Safe, unharmed, a little defiant maybe, but alive and fine. So, from almost the very beginning, the working theory was straightforward. Lori ran away again. She is with someone. She will turn up like she always has. It is a logical conclusion when you look at the history. It is also the conclusion that gave someone exactly the breathing room they needed. Day 2 arrived with no sign of Lori and no meaningful leads. Investigators began casting a wider net. During canvassing, a neighbor mentioned that there were registered sex offenders living in the surrounding area. Officers immediately began locating and visiting each one, checking properties, asking questions, looking carefully for anything that might connect them to a missing 12-year-old girl. One man answered his front door and told officers he was on probation before they had even finished introducing themselves. He stepped aside and let them look around without being asked. He walked them through the property, showed them the shed out back, answered every question put to him, clean. There's no connection to Lori, nothing. Officers worked through every name on the list, checked every address, and came away from each one with the same result. No evidence, no red flags, no thread that connected any of them to what was happening. The search kept expanding. Investigators began reaching out to everyone who had ever been a part of Lori's life in any meaningful way. Teachers, neighbors, family friends, people she had spent time with. Anyone who might be holding even a small piece of information that could explain where she had gone or who she might be with. They visited a woman Lori had stayed with during one of her prior disappearances. Someone Lori had trusted enough to go to when things felt like too much at home. A safe place, as far as anyone could tell. When the detective knocked on that door, the woman had already spoken to several officers before this visit. She repeated what she had told all of them. Lori wasn't there. She hadn't been there. And the moment Lori showed up, she would call. But then the conversation moved somewhere else. The woman began talking about who Lori was, not as a missing person, as a child she had known. And what she described was detailed and specific in a way that stayed with investigators well after they left that porch. She talked about a girl who was unusually perceptive for her age, who had figured out, somewhere along the way, how adults respond to certain kinds of behavior, who understood that drawing attention, even negative attention, even the difficult kind, was a tool, a way of getting needs met when more straightforward approaches hadn't worked. She described someone who could hold on to something for a long time without letting it show, and then use it with precision when the moment presented itself. Lori is really good at spinning lies, like I've never seen anything like it before. Hold on to that description. Don't discard it. Don't accept it without question either. Just hold it, because it is going to matter later, not in the way the woman meant it, but in a way that only becomes visible when you look back at everything from the other side of what investigators eventually found. Weeks passed. The days blurred together the way they do in an investigation that keeps producing nothing. The case moved from active and urgent to something quieter, officers still working it, still following threads. But the energy of the early days, the door-to-door canvassing, the neighborhood-wide search, the sense that Lori could turn up at any moment, that had faded. 2 months in, investigators had no confirmed sightings of Lori since the day she disappeared. No physical evidence pointing in any direction. No arrests, no person of interest who had been seriously and thoroughly examined. Just a file getting thicker with interviews that led nowhere, and tips that dissolved as soon as you tried to follow them seriously. And then a witness came forward. A young man said he had been spending time at the local skate park when he noticed something that hadn't seemed significant until he saw the flyer with Lori's face on it. He described 2 cars arriving within minutes of each other. A white sedan, 2013 model, paint faded and worn down in patches, and a red Honda SUV, 2016, with distinctive curved taillights he recognized immediately because of his familiarity with cars. He said he watched a girl matching Lori's description get out of the back seat of the white car, walk around to the trunk, pull out a duffel bag, cross over to the red SUV, climb into the front passenger seat, and drive away. For the first time in weeks, investigators had something that felt solid, real, a sighting with specific details attached to it, vehicle descriptions, a sequence of events, a direction. They went to the skate park, canvassed the streets around it, pulled every camera in the area that might have captured footage from the day in question, looked for any corroborating witness who might have been there and seen the same thing. Nothing matched. No white sedan, no red Honda. Said no camera footage showing any part of what the witness had described. The tip came apart completely under scrutiny, whether the young man had been genuinely mistaken or had constructed the account from something he'd seen elsewhere and half remembered. Investigators couldn't determine with certainty, but the result was the same either way. More time spent, more resources directed at a road with nothing at the end of it, and once again the investigation was exactly where it had started. Officers went to the school, sat across from teachers and staff members who had known Lori. Tried to trace a rumor that had surfaced online. Someone had posted about Lori's case and mentioned hearing that she may have been in contact with a significantly older man. The kind of claim that, if accurate, could shift the entire direction of the investigation. But nobody at the school could give them a clean, traceable answer. The rumor had passed through too many people by the time it reached investigators. One person thought it came from a behavioral specialist who worked with Lori. Another thought a student had said something. A third person couldn't remember where they had heard it at all. Every path looped back around to the same fog of secondhand accounts and unverifiable hearsay. What investigators did find at the school was something they hadn't been looking for. something that didn't crack the case open but quietly added another layer to the portrait while they were building of a child who had been asking for help in every way available to her. Teachers remembered a girl who gravitated consistently toward adults rather than peers, who sought out one-on-one conversations, who wanted to be seen and heard by the grown-ups around her in a way that stood out. She really wanted to talk to adults, said like an observation, like a quirk noted in a behavioral file, and filed away without much further thought. But sit with that for a moment. A 12-year-old girl who persistently seeks adult connection and attention is not necessarily a troubled child with a manipulation problem. She might be a child who is trying, in every way she can figure out, to tell the people around her that something at home is not right, that she needs someone to pay attention, that she is reaching toward anyone who might actually hear her. The adults in Lori's life had spent years interpreting that signal as a behavioral issue. Nobody stopped to ask what she might be reaching away from. The investigation pressed forward, slowly, without any single breakthrough moment, without the dramatic turn that makes cases resolve cleanly and quickly. Just the slow accumulation of details and questions and conversations that didn't individually seem like much, but were beginning, quietly, to point in a direction. Investigators went back through every statement they had collected, every interview, every piece of information gathered over months of work. They started looking at things they had initially treated as background detail, things that had seemed unimportant when the focus was on finding Lori out in the world somewhere. They looked more carefully at the medications. Lori had been prescribed medication for anxiety, a proper diagnosis, a proper prescription. It's the kind of thing that involves doctors and records and a structured system of oversight around a child's mental health and well-being. But during one of their many conversations with people close to the family, investigators had been told something that hadn't fully registered the first time they heard it. Something about those medications being stopped, without a doctor involved, without the proper process followed. A decision made quietly by one person that had direct consequences for a 12-year-old girl's health and stability. She weaned Lori off of those medications before she brought her down. On its own, maybe that's a parenting decision someone could argue about. Complicated, perhaps misguided, but not necessarily sinister. Except investigators weren't looking at it on its own anymore. That they were looking at it as one piece of a much larger picture that was slowly, painstakingly coming into focus. A picture of decisions being made about Lori, over her, around her, without her full understanding, by the adults in her life. Decisions that shaped her world in ways she couldn't control. Decisions that were quiet and largely invisible to anyone on the outside looking in. And investigators started asking what other decisions had been made inside that apartment that nobody outside of it had ever known about. They went back to the timeline of the day Lori disappeared. This time, they broke it down carefully, hour by hour, movement by movement, every phone record, every location data point, every moment that could be placed and verified against what they had been told. And they found something that hadn't been there before. Or rather, something that had always been there, but hadn't been looked at with fresh enough eyes until now. A gap. Not in Lori's movements, in someone else's. Location data placed a specific person somewhere they had never mentioned being, on the day Lori went missing, during a window of time that had never been properly accounted for in any of the conversations investigators had conducted over the previous months. Do you know if you went to Jacksonville? Because it looks like you went just before you went to work. That question landed differently than any question that had come before it in this investigation. It wasn't background. It wasn't routine. It was specific. Based on evidence. Aimed directly at a gap in a story that had, up until this moment, appeared to hold together reasonably well. And the answer that came back didn't hold together at all. Details shifted. Things that should have been easy to explain weren't. An account that had remained smooth and consistent through months of conversations suddenly had edges. Places where what was being said didn't match what the records showed. Inconsistencies that were small individually, but stacked on top of everything else investigators had quietly been building, were impossible to look past. For the first time in 2 years, the ground beneath this case felt different. Investigators went back further, pulled more records, cross-referenced more details, looked at everything they had, every interview, every tip, every piece of information from every person who had known Lori, through a completely different lens than the one they had been using. Man, the picture that emerged was nothing like the one they had been handed at the very beginning. The story of a girl who simply ran away, who had done it before, who was difficult and prone to disappearing on her own terms, whose behavioral history made her absence feel almost predictable. That story had always been doing something. It had shaped the investigation from its very first hours. It had pointed attention outward, toward the neighborhood, toward the registry, toward the skate park and the abandoned apartments and the family friends and the online rumors, away from Continental Court, away from that apartment, away from the person who had been inside it the night Lori disappeared. Because Lori hadn't run away, she had never left. And the person who had known that from the very first knock on the door, the person who had stood there answering questions, handing out flyers, staying in contact with investigators, maintaining the careful and convincing performance of a parent desperate to find his daughter. That person was Andrew Wiley, her father, the one who made the call, the one who had been standing right in front of them since the beginning of all of this. 2 years. That is how long it held together. 2 years of a secret carried in plain sight, wrapped inside the role of a grieving parent, protected by a story about a complicated child who had a history of running and lying and seeking attention in ways that made the adults around her tired. That story hadn't been built to describe Lori. It had been built to bury her, and it had almost worked. But investigators who refuse to let a case go cold keep pulling threads, quietly, patiently, long after the public has stopped paying attention and the headlines have moved on to something else. They keep going back. Keep asking the questions that didn't get fully answered the first time. Keep looking at the details that didn't quite fit and wondering what they actually mean. And eventually, not with one dramatic moment, not with a single confession or a sudden breakthrough, but through the slow and unglamorous accumulation of everything they had refused to stop looking at, the truth found its way to the surface. Lori Paige was 12 years old. She deserved a childhood. She deserved to grow up and figure out who she was going to become. She deserved adults around her who, when she kept reaching toward them the way she did, and actually stopped and asked what she was reaching away from. She deserved someone who looked at the gaps in the story being told about her and asked the next question. She deserved so much more than what she got. The least we can do is make sure her story is told. The least we can do is refuse to look away. Because Lori Paige needed someone to finally ask the right question. And in the end, after 2 years of the wrong ones, someone did.